Hello, welcome to Introspection with Jeff. This is a channel to understand and empower yourself. I deal with substance. I want you to improve yourself every day. Today, I'm continuing with the video you may have seen before about the Myers-Briggs personality tests. Myers-Briggs personality types, the 16 personality types. I decided to add this video on because number one, I look pretty nice. Number two, it adds to that type. Today I want to talk about the theory of generational archetypes. Specifically, they were developed by William Strauss and Neil Howe. Their first book was in 1991. It was called Generations. And I came across this book probably in the early 2000s, early to mid 2000s. Basically, the premise of the concept is that is something that really intrigues me. We are conditioned to think of people in history as all the same, all uniform, essentially. They're not affected by their childhood influences or anything like that. We tend to link people in public life with the times that they were active. However, there are four phases of life. There's childhood, there's early adulthood, there's adulthood, midlife, and elderhood. And this theory takes that into account. This theory also splits up the time, the world history itself, or at least the common, perhaps national history, into four stages. And what I like about this is that you have four different stages, and at each stage, each of the four generational archetypes is experiencing that stage from a different perspective. For example, in the 1980s, the prophet generation would have been, I believe, young adulthood or adulthood during that generation, which is very different from the experience like I had, which was childhood. In childhood, as a nomad, I watched television, I collected toys, comic books, and so forth. I was going through school. That's a much different experience from somebody in adulthood in that same time period. So I think they dovetail very nicely with each other as the stages cycle through history. All right. Firstly, let me mention the four archetypes. The four archetypes and the four stages in time. The four archetypes are prophet, nomad, hero, and artist. And then the artist generation then gives birth to the prophet generation. The four stages are, unraveling, crisis, high, and awakening. Now, there's one period of unraveling from 1908 to 1929, and you can probably guess why it's called the unraveling. There was another unraveling period, according to this research, from 1984 to 2008. All right, so going back to the earlier unraveling period, 1908 to 1929, after that comes a crisis period, 1929 to 1946, a high period from 1946 to 1964, and an awakening period from 1964 to 1984. And then, as I mentioned before, 1984 to 2008 saw the period of another unraveling occurring. Now, let me characterize each stage. The unraveling period, during the unraveling period, The artist is entering elderhood. Um, the prophet is simultaneously entering midlife. The nomad enters young adulthood, about 21, 22, 20s, and so forth, and 30s. And the hero generation enters childhood. And so, as I said before, at each stage, the generational archetype well, not the generational archetype. The generational archetype advances through a period of life from childhood to young adulthood, and so forth, midlife, and so forth, so that um, you take the same, like, for example, I'm a nomad. During the let me see 1984, during the unraveling period, I would have been a child, and then that's the unraveling. Then the crisis period, I would have aged into the next phase. It's childhood, young adult. So I would have been entering young adulthood, and then the next phase, the high, would have been midlife, and then the awakening period would have been elderhood. Okay, so let me go through the archetypes, and because they have some influence when they reach adulthood on what's going on in the world on that stage of time, I think it's best to describe them right now. The nomad generation. I should also say that it's interesting. The two authors pointed out that the nicknames given to generations over the years tended to resemble the personality traits and the types, the traits associated with those archetypes. The nomad generation, as a child, in childhood, as children, they have a reputation for being bad. During coming of age, they become alienated or have the stigma of alienation. Their primary focus of life is self-sufficiency. They're savvy, they're practical, they're very perceptive. Their values are liberty, honor, and survival. As young adults, they're competing. All right, I'd have to look into that further. Transition into midlife, they're frenetic to the point of perhaps being exhausted. Entering elderhood, their leadership style is solitary and pragmatic. And then their reputation as elders is tough, one of toughness. Their treatment as elders is abandonment. They're abandoned as elders, which is kind of a sad note. Then the next generation after them, in other words, they would have children. And I should also point out that the nomad generation, the more recent nomad generation nickname had been Generation X. So you may have heard stereotypes, whether good or bad, about Generation X. In fact, X implying we don't know what to do with these people. They're just Generation X. Then Generation Y, it's the hero generation. I think they're also the homestead generation. I'm not sure. They would be born from 1982 to 2004. And I should also mention that the nomad generation, the recent nomad generation, was born between 1964, something like that, to 1981. And those years can vary a little bit. I see this as more fluid, somewhat. The hero generation grows up as increasingly protected, as opposed to their parents. In other words, the parents grew up in a laissez-faire environment. Anything goes. The movies were raunchy, probably grotesque, ugly, little little efforts to protect them from things that they shouldn't touch. They were free to walk around. Their parents, the prophet generation parents, would have been self-indulged, involved, or for whatever reason, focusing on their own lives, leaving the nomad children to grow up in a world to fend for themselves, to grossly state it, grow up amongst themselves. You may have heard of the term latchkey kid that was attached to the Generation X, which is a nomad generation. Um, they have to be smart, they have to be clever, they have to know how to confront danger and know how to avoid danger. They're monkey bars, dangerous construction sites, hardly any sign. Well, I shouldn't say hardly any, but fewer signs to warn you about potential dangers. This may be, the real life experience, the real life familiarity of this might be sinking in to many of you. Okay, so the nomad generation grew up like that. So consequently, their children, they bring up as perhaps overprotected. There's more of an effort to protect our children, have safety standards, have warning labels all over. There's an increased public focus on the safety and health care and well-being of our children. Right, so the hero generation, again, that would be 1982 to 2004. That's their experience in childhood. They grow up extremely or increasingly protected. In midlife, they're overly confident and energetic. That's something I very much applaud. I'm happy about that. And then going into elderhood, this is something very interesting. There's something very markedly unique about the hero generation. They grow into being, in elderhood, politically powerful elders. They remain very active in politics and in public life. And you'll see that reflected in the ages, the stages of history that I'll get into in a moment. The prophet generation is very much the, I forgot the artist generation. The artist generation is a generation after the hero. In other words, it would be the children of the hero generation. I didn't write down notes, honestly, but I remember from what I've read that the artist generation is relatively protected. There's an attitude going on towards more communal life, more public life. The institutions are becoming strong as they grow up. They're more of a focus, as opposed to the generation at the opposite end, the father generation of the nomad generation, which would be the prophets. And that's the point, that's the other extreme, where you have at some period in at some point in history, the institutions are being broken apart. They're being criticized, heavily criticized, and in some sense rightly so. And the emphasis on the individual becomes prominent. You see a lot of books. It's interesting. The authors, when they were, or at least one of the authors, I think, anyway, the authors, when they were being interviewed, mentioned that you see this in books. What popular books are around at the times when these generations are entering adulthood or midlife, probably early adulthood. The emphasis during the prophet generation would be that the individual is powerful and that institutions are preventing the individual from being all that he or she could be. All right, so you have the two extremes, the prophet generation, the artist generation. The artist generation is named so because as adults, they create great works of art institutions, social institutions, and physical institutions are strong. There's a degree of safety, a public safety, and long-standing. There's an assuredness of things that will last a long time. So they're free to create great works of art, things that are regarded in future generations with nostalgia, perhaps. Um, Television shows and other books, novels, literature, great works of art, paintings, new visual styles, very innovative in terms of new visual style, new artistry in general, innovative ideas. All right, so let me mention. I'm sorry, I didn't mention the members of the artist generation. But let me mention some examples of the prophet generation. And notice that, well, many of them are public figures, but notice that notice that something I like, that they could be from even different centuries. You could have some from the 20th century mixed with some from the 19th or 18th century. In fact, when the two authors, William Strauss and Neil Howe, were developing this theory, they looked back, as it's claimed in Wikipedia, they looked back to 1584 biographies going back to 1584 to formulate this. What I like about this is that George Washington isn't simply an old man with white hair and in his 50s, something like that. He's a great statesman and leader, and he's merged with Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams and all the great American revolutionary heroes. No, you see a generational divide, just as you see now in modern life. Let's see if perhaps from your own knowledge of these figures, do they correspond to the appropriate generational archetypal traits, the stereotypical traits? All right, so we start off with the prophet generation. You have Franklin Roosevelt, and again, this is not when they were active in public life. This is a collection of a certain generation born in a certain era, experiencing the four stages in history until the four stages repeat themselves and then repeat themselves. This is one group collectively together experiencing childhood in the same stage of time, and then as it shifts to the next stage of time, the same group advances with it, but now they're older. They were children, now they're young adults. And then it advances again, now they're midlife, and then it advances again, and now they're elders. All right, so this group of prophets includes Franklin Roosevelt, Herbert Hoover. It's interesting that they're both of the same generation, considering Herbert Hoover was very much I believe, a laissez-faire. He believed that business could be able to help us out of the Depression. I believe so. He didn't want, as president, he didn't want to enter in and meddle around with things. FDR, however, ran against it. I believe he ran against it. Because Hoover had only one term. And at that point, they didn't have the 22nd Amendment. So you could have a president running theoretically more than twice, serving as president more than twice. The 22nd Amendment was passed, I believe, during Eisenhower's administration. But you can remember this because Franklin Roosevelt served essentially 4 terms, and he died during his 4th term. So you can imagine him being a Democrat, the Republicans were eager to put in the 22nd Amendment that you can only serve 2 terms. Just happened to be that way, that it was the 22nd Amendment that you serve only 2 terms. Or 1 term if you're not that popular. All right. So you have Franklin Roosevelt, Herbert Hoover, Samuel Adams, who's not necessarily the alcoholic beverage, Benjamin Franklin, James Polk. Interesting that these merged together, and Abraham Lincoln. They're all members of the Prophet generation. It's interesting that Abraham Lincoln is in the Prophet generation, but perhaps there are some of you that can explain how he could exemplify the Prophet generation. All right, then you have the Nomad generation. Here's the eye catcher for me personally, George Washington, who is a generation younger than Benjamin Franklin. Remember, these are the ones that grew up. If the theory holds well, they grew up like Generation X. They were the Generation X of their time periods. Their prophet parents were focused on themselves or focused on other things, leaving them to fend for themselves essentially as young adults. They learned very quickly how to survive and how to be clever and avoid dangers. George Washington, Nathaniel Bacon, John Adams, Ulysses Grant, Dwight Eisenhower, that's interesting, and Barack Obama. Barack Obama being one of the more recent presidents. All right, then you have the hero generation. Now, the two authors, Neil Howe and William Strauss, have pointed out that there were no heroes during the Civil War era. By that they mean that there were no artists. I'm sorry. I remember there were no heroes. Because the hero generation tends to go out as soldiers. As I will mention in the time epics, the time archetypes, at a certain point, there will be a war that comes unexpectedly, and that the nomad generation is typically the one, or would be in the position of being leaders to command the hero generation, who then goes out into battle as young soldiers. I remember the two authors mentioning that there were no heroes in the Civil War, and it had to do with the generation dying off. I suppose they died off, right? There were so many members of the hero generation who died during the Civil War that they didn't continue. There was a population shortage. They didn't continue on. There weren't as many artists there weren't as many heroes to then give birth to artistic descendants. All right, so the hero generation, they grow up, as I said before, during increasingly... I read that part. Okay, sorry. All right, so the artist generation, Thomas Jefferson, John F. Kennedy, Prince William. I think John F. Kennedy very much characterizes a hero generation. Prince William, Priyanka Chopra, and Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg. Okay, now I'll go explain the other side of the coin. I've mentioned the generational archetypes. Now I'll mention the epics. They go through a period of unraveling, which I've said before was 1908 to 1929, and then a crisis period, 1929 to 1946, and then a high, 1946 to 1964, and then an awakening, 1964 to 1984, and then unraveling again, 1984 to 2008. So the next phase would have been a crisis, and I'm guessing that would have been the attack on the Twin Towers in 2001. And then you can backtrack before 1908. It's the same 4 cycles. Okay, so, all right, to put it succinctly, the unraveling period, individual pragmatism, self-reliance, laissez-faire. I'm wondering where I should start. Okay, so during the unraveling period, generally, the nation isn't focused on external threats. There's an internal kind of spiritual unraveling period, where the nation as a whole is focused on its own domestic concerns. Then that leads to a crisis. Now, in our modern age, that would have been the planes hitting the Twin Towers. I hope YouTube doesn't strike me for that. In the previous crisis period, I'm sorry, yes, that marked the point ushering in our crisis period. The previous cycle of four, the crisis period would have been Pearl Harbor, and that launched us into World War II. And then before Pearl Harbor would have been the unraveling period then. That's when the generation of young heroes, hero generation, that's when they are about 18, soldier-ish age. They go into battle, and the nomad generation is a step above, a step older, and they're in the leadership positions. I have here, to characterize the crisis generation, great dangers cut down, social and political complexity. Great dangers cut down social and political complexity in favor of political consensus, aggressive institutions, an ethic of personal sacrifice. In other words, that's in marked contrast to the prior unraveling period, where we had individual pragmatism, self-reliance, laissez-faire. Let me break this down. Essentially, it's saying that in the crisis, that it's as if the nation realizes that there needs to be a public consensus. It's not all individualism, which had been very strong during the unraveling period. Everybody to himself, and you go do you. You are your own person, and I'm going to go off and do my own thing. And essentially, to put it crudely, nuts to everybody else. I'm going to be my own person. And then the crisis period, the crisis event, launches us into a crisis period, which we as a nation realize we can't do that anymore. We have to stick together. We have to stay strong together as a nation in order to fight off this crisis, this danger. And the squabbling goes down, hopefully. Political and ideological infighting hopefully goes down. They realize what's truly at stake. Then there's a high period characterized by rejuvenated community life, a consensus around a new social order, whatever that may be, and the prophets are indulged children. They're self-absorbed. Remember, they would have been, I'm not sure what age they would have been. Oh no, I'm sorry. It says right here, indulged children. So during this high period, they are children, and they're self-absorbed. They're very indulged. So then that high period, as I remember from my reading, is that it's very much like it goes up and goes down, goes up and goes down. Nationhood is at its lowest during the crisis period. There's been an unraveling, and then the crisis nationhood is at its lowest mark. And then at the same time, individuality is at its strongest. And then during the crisis, it goes up and reverses, so that nationhood is becoming more popular and individualism is less so, till it reaches a high, which I think of as the 1960s, and it matches in here. The 1960s, social institutions are strong. Not only that, but the phrase high, high meaning that there's pride in the country, there's national pride, and there's solidarity. Um, JFK is president. You are perhaps aware of these famous speeches. That's when JFK launches a moonshot program. These words, I believe our nation should, notice this, I believe our nation should commit itself to launching a man into space on the moon, and I believe our nation should commit itself to putting a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth. And you see, there was something else. JFK's famous words, which, as I've heard later on, were actually taken from an Irish writer. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's very much in the style of a high period. All right, and the dates here, 1946 to 1964. JFK was president from 1961 to 1963, sadly not till 1964. Then after that, institutions become so reinforced, so cemented in daily life that this begins a period of awakening, a spiritual awakening, for example, where critics point out the problems and the assumptions in these institutions that had to be built up during the last period, when the last unraveling period, when social institutions were broken down and we hit a crisis that that was unexpected and we were vastly, sadly unprepared for. So again, during the unraveling period, so the awakening, the preceding awakening period, had succeeded in breaking down social and important, crucial institutions that were needed to keep us protected. That's the unraveling, and then the crisis hits, and we're unprepared because these institutions had been broken apart. So that now we're in the crisis, and then during the crisis we have to build back these institutions, and then the institutions are high at a point, are put into permanent structure, so to speak, and we're at a high where the individual is weak and the larger national social institution is strong. Then there's an awakening period when critics point out flaws in these strong, sturdy social institutions. I'm wondering if the feminist movement came in during this time. 1964 to 1984. That would have been when the feminist movement kicked in. That's when you saw criticisms about race. You saw poverty becoming an issue, so forth. What can we do to help these impoverished people? What can we do to equalize the sexes in the workplace and in social life? Recognize that they are equal. And as I wrote down from the awakening period, it's a period of social ideals, spiritual agendas, and young adults are passionately attacking the established institutional order. I wonder also, that's when Dr. Spock had come into prominence, I think, with his book. Dr. Spock, who's not the fictional character in the TV show Star Trek, although perhaps named after this person, although perhaps the fictional character was named after this person. I think his first name was Benjamin. Dr. Spock, to some degree, revolutionized or he wrote literature that was read about the new ways, the different ways, the alternative ways of rearing young children in ways that were not the norm at that time. So that describes the two sides of the coin: the generational archetypes and the simultaneous four stages. And as I said before, they look through biographies going way back to 1584. Their first book was Generations. Their next book in 1991. Their next book was in 1997. It was called The Fourth Turning. And there's at least one more book, the 13th generation, I believe. Before closing, I should also mention that there are some nicknames commonly thrown around. Let me introduce you to which nicknames go with which generation. The Prophet generation were the baby boomers. More recently, secondly, were the baby boomers. They grew up. Bit of history. After World War II, the GIs come home and they have lots and lots of kids. There's a huge increase in the number of people being born. Those are the baby boomers. That would have been the Prophet generation. And then after that, their children are nicknamed Generation X. Those are the nomads. Then the nomads' children are named the hero generation. They're Generation Y. I guess if you go from Generation X to Generation Y. I believe they're also the homestead generation, something like that. No, it wouldn't be homestead generation. That wouldn't fit. It would be something to do with hero. They were also the GI generation, the greatest generation, the ones who fought in World War II. And then after that, you have the artist generation. That would have been the silent generation. And also Generation Z. I have to look this up to see which nickname goes with what, but you can do that for yourself. Look up, see which nicknames go with which generational archetype in order. So that being said, I'd like to close by mentioning that you should find your hand in the universe. This is Stan Tenon's posit that when he was studying the Bible, he was intrigued by the idea that the Hebrew letters were actually shadows of your hand. And that combined with the idea, that, from what I've heard, that those who go through meditation and like out-of-body experiences, surreal experiences, it's been said that if you can look at your hand, it's part of you, and that you can reconnect with your true self, reconnect with yourself. If reality doesn't seem familiar, if it doesn't seem to fit quite right, look to your hand and or look to find that part of yourself that you know that fits reality. I'll work on that. I'll work on how I phrase that. If you like this video, please like it and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I wish to see you in further videos. I wish you will see me in future videos. And with that being said, I'll have an interesting topic for you next time. So long.